Right, good afternoon everybody. Are we all right to go ahead? Natasha? Ms. Ingle, I think it is, from the States, thank you. And is it Senator Ferguson? All right, okay. Sorry? Jersey Construction Council. Could you just say something to let us know that you're able to listen and we can hear you, please? Okay, we can't hear you. I'm going to continue while you try and sort that out. I'm assuming that I can be heard. Can you thumbs up if you can hear me? Good. Okay. We'll try and sort out the your vocals as we go along. Right. Okay. So there are some issues about which I'll ask the Minister to respond to in a minute. But do you want to make a brief summary of your point? You think it's too onerous, the information required with regard to carbon emissions and the relative sustainability of demolition as opposed to refurbishment is not very well put and could actually be a disincentive to development. Is that a summary of your case?
I think that summarises it fairly well, yes, thank you, sir. I think that while the intent behind the policy, of course I endorse, we all want to be more sustainable, we all want futures for our younger generations coming through. But the way in which this policy goes about is impossible for us to really achieve, I think, particularly at such an early stage as planning. Quite often we won't have necessarily the method of construction. It puts probably 3 design schemes and the cost of those 3 schemes to our clients before they've even got any certainty that they're going to have a building at all. One for renovation, one for perhaps part demolition, and one for complete demolition. It's a very difficult policy to come at that sort of design stage. One thing I would say about this policy, sir, if I may, is that there's some description from the Minister in SR 44 which describes his intent for the policy. This intent in SR 44 is actually completely different from the policy wording itself, and if I may say so, it's perhaps more manageable in the Bridging Island Plan than the policy as written. It's a bit more lenient. It gives an indication perhaps of not having to prove necessarily everything, but have the intent for the way about going about things.
Yeah, I've just been rereading that, but it's not it's not got any paragraph numbers. Is this under the section approach to demolition and replacement of buildings?
Perhaps
that
I
you're
could
talking
read
about?
a short section of it, but the preamble to the policy explains that the information is required where appropriate, and that in such cases the developer will be required to consider the carbon impact and provide an estimation in relation to it. So it does not ask for this to be absolutely proven, nor does not ask anything more than an estimate. So, so the wording there is very much about the intent, about the destination that we're trying to get to, but that we might not know yet, which is frankly where planning quite often is for us. And yet the wording sort of in the policy is very much about proving it. It's about substantiating exact figures. And I think that is the unrealistic bit that we're all kind of largely struggling with. I don't know if any others around these tables want to further their thoughts on that, but that's where I certainly think it struggles. So.
Yes, Ms. Scott, what do you want to add to that?
Yes, sir. Well, in the case of any sort of like tourist business along the shoreline zone, the shoreline zone of St Brillard's Bay, on top of that we have an additional amendment that would restrict them from increasing their size, because that's a proposed amendment by the Minister in response to GD9, and all missing the point that we would say that that there could well be cases where businesses, just to kind of support their product, hotels to actually develop better and improve themselves, may not be able to be absolutely net zero when it comes to being demolished and replacing themselves. And so we believe that there needs to be a bit more flexibility here for tourist businesses, at least.
What, in GD5 you want a specific clause about tourist businesses in policy GD5? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think if you're going to accept the language of GD5, at least limit it to residential buildings, and then say in the case of non-residential buildings, some demonstration would be required of being mindful of trying to reduce carbon impact as such.
Has anyone else got any other points they want to make about the relative? Mr. Nicholson, do you want to say anything about the impact of this potentially on development proposals?
Well, this is about the application of GD5 and the question mark about the specific nature of what's actually required. The content of GD5 relates to demolition and replacement of buildings, and it talks about this being presented as part of the environmental or sustainability benefits of a proposal. And in the supporting text, the middle of page 86, on the page before, it says, as a minimum, a sustainability statement should address the following factors, supported by evidence where appropriate. Yet we have, on the very next page, we have a proposal in the green box saying the Minister will review and issue supplementary planning guidance to guide the preparation and submission of statements of sustainability. So I think there is a general appreciation that there is going to be some guidance. We don't know actually what it's going to need to, what it's going to set out and what applicants are going to need to provide. My point is that it is going to be very difficult for anyone to demonstrate compliance with GD5 when we don't actually know what we're going to have to comply with.
Yeah. I suppose Mr. Pilley is probably going to say that that's building flexibility into the policy, but if flexibility's got to be deliverable. I mean, it seems to me the problem here is, I mean, many of these issues are not necessarily that clear-cut, are they, in terms of the relative sustainability of new build, possibly at higher density, using different materials with much better energy consumption requirements, and refurbishing something that maybe doesn't meet modern standards so well. I mean, any comments so far? And is the Jersey Construction Council able to hear now and be seen and heard? I presume this is their main interest, but in the meantime, Mr. Pilley, would you like to respond to some, or is it Mrs. Day?
I mean, a few points raised, just drawing off Mr. Ball's point about, sometimes this information isn't really readily available when you're submitting a planning application. Well, the whole point of this policy is to adopt a fabric-first approach, and the consideration of the retention of the building must be a first consideration. So that's a baseline requirement for the consideration of schemes. The policy specifically attempts to address the issues that were felt with the previous iteration of this policy in the 2011 Island Plan, which was subsequently withdrawn in the 2014 review. And it's accepted that policy wasn't particularly workable. It was wholly dependent on guidance, as the submission to the planning inspectors during the interim review, we were very clear that actually it's because we're not quite there yet with the data that you need to support these kind of things. Well, a lot has happened since then. We've got the declaration of a climate emergency, not just in Jersey, but globally it's recognised as an issue, and there's been significant advances in how we understand things like embodied carbon in buildings. So this plan, whilst it is completely acknowledged that things like embodied carbon calculations are quite in their formative stages, there is certainly systems out there that can be used, and the Minister for the Environment is actually actively working on guidance to support this, obviously, because it goes in hand with the climate emergency work that's ongoing, and consideration of things like LETI standards, the SCBS whole life carbon tool, which is incredibly useful. The Minister doesn't expect that carbon assessments are going to be absolutely precise at this stage. This is about a learning curve between agents, developers and the government to establish a baseline with embodied carbon, and that is crucially important given where we are. So that I hope that it covers off why we've chosen to reintroduce this policy. We do recognise that it did have its implementation challenges. There is a need to be very open-minded about the other sustainability considerations, and we think the policy adequately tries to address that. So how appropriate a development density might be relative to its place, and we've spoken already about how this Bridging Island Plan attempts to make significant progress in the consideration of what might be an appropriate density relative to the place that something is happening. It's also recognised that we want to publish specific supplementary planning guidance to identify appropriate densities. So, as I say, I really do want to reinforce that this policy is significantly more mature than the previous. Drawing off Mr Nicholson's point about sustainability statements, for people who are familiar with island plans, you'll note that this plan tries to adopt a more guidance approach in the preamble to the policy to set out what will be expected. And whilst we do say that sustainability statements would benefit from additional guidance, there are actually clear bullet points in this policy as to what we would expect within that statement in this policy. And that will be then supplemented with the guidance such as, whole life carbon assessment, what toolkits are available to developers to include in that statement. So as you've already alluded to, the policy absolutely stands in its own right. The guidance is about providing additional support, but we don't want to also reduce the need for flexibility in the policy.
Okay, does anyone want to comment about that in terms of how you would like to see the policy reworded, or whether you want it just removed? Yeah, all right. Yes, so who are you?
It's Bob Goddell from the Chamber of Commerce.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. My biggest problem with this is a bit like a primary school policy. It's well intended, but it's referring to sciences which don't really exist at the moment. The thing is that obviously the sciences involved in carbon, embodied carbon, is a developing science, but in order for the department to say that that this is just guidance, I don't understand how they're actually going to assess information which is submitted to the department, if it's just a nice-to-have kind of report, surely it needs to be assessed on firm science and firm figures. And our point is that those firm figures do not exist at the moment. They simply do not exist. And they may exist in nascent form in various jurisdictions around the world. But to be honest, embodied carbon measurements are changing on a day-to-day basis in industry. If we are required to produce firm figures to support an application, those figures are simply not available. They're not available in Jersey because we have the added implication of transport of materials into Jersey. And it requires some kind of input from the states, not just to say what they're going to expect as part of this, as part of an SPG, but actually to do some work on behalf of the industry to find out what the implications are of import of materials into the island, and what the potential implications are of using different materials that are potentially imported into the island. Unfortunately, what this is going to engender, in my view, is a raft of snake oil consultancies who will be able to argue that black is white and white is black. And there will be nobody in the department who is going to be able to properly scientifically assess whether the information that they're receiving is actually accurate or not. It'll be similar to the situation that occurs at the moment with the E1 policy, which requires valuations to be made for industrial premises, whereby there is nobody in the department who is qualified to assess whether the exercise has been properly undertaken. And effectively what happens is that the planning officer or the planning department as a whole decides on the basis of very minimum information as to whether they believe it or they don't believe it. And unfortunately, this is just such an airy-fairy proposal at the moment that it just is incapable of effective implementation. So personally, we think...
So you're saying it's not deliverable?
It's totally not deliverable. I don't
So
understand.
what do you want to do with it? Do you want to rewrite it, or do you want to...
I don't think it should be there. Until such time as there is peer-reviewed benchmark data that is able to be used by the industry and by the department in order to analyse what is actually submitted to them.
I'll allow you to come back in a minute. Mr. Bull, do you want to make any other comment?
So I don't know whether Mr. Matthews from the Construction Council is able to speak, but if he isn't...
From my point of view, I'd like to hear him speak, but we need to...
I was just going to answer, with a different hat, I also sit as a director on the Construction Council.
Okay.
I think that probably one of the points my colleague may have made is about the availability of labour and materials within his industry to give flexibility at the design stage, at the costing stage. Obviously, in the island at the moment, we have a number of projects which is stretching our industry and the number of trades within the industry. So larger developments or a series of large developments might choose different construction methods based on what labour is available and what materials can be available. Again, I know that there potentially would be flexibility within the system. We're not really sure yet as to what happens at planning versus what actually gets built, I guess, as long as the fabric is good and it meets the general requirements, whatever those requirements may be. But we do need that flexibility, I think, within our industry to inform, to evaluate and cost these projects to make them viable. Thank you.
Yes, thanks. How's it going with the Construction Council? Can we get them? Yeah, sorry. Simon, can you speak, please? In the meantime, would you like to respond to that? Is there anything else you can say about deliverability and, you know, the availability of the data that is being questioned here, essentially? That it's just, you know, it's too early to introduce this policy.
Yes. So I think that one of the first points that Mr. Goddell raised was about the need to better understand the carbon impact of imported materials into Jersey. For context, that would apply to Jersey's Scope 3 carbon emissions. Scope 3 carbon emissions around the world are notoriously difficult to assess, and we wouldn't claim to believe that we could have a firm understanding of that in the near future. That is certainly an evolving area, but not to say that we shouldn't have regard to it just because it's evolving. And of course, Jersey has the ability to take the lead in understanding these things, which we, of course, are trying to do with the progression of our carbon neutral roadmap. So I'm somewhat trying to find a polite word to use. Disappointed that the opinion is that because something is difficult to do, that we shouldn't try to do the right thing. I will raise to you that in the course of the current island plan, our waste management policies have not been effectively applied. So we've seen high volumes of waste arriving at our Le Collet landfill, non-compliance with site waste management plans. Jersey is not adopting a long-term sustainable approach to managing its construction waste, and we obviously need to do something to address that by tightening up our policies on waste management, which we've attempted to do in this plan, tightening up the monitoring and compliance of site waste management plans, and of course trying to prevent the source origin of that waste by taking a more sustainable approach to the demolition of buildings and retaining fabric where possible. So I do appreciate that the policy intent is agreed. I would also agree that, yes, there will be challenges in implementation, but I would refute that we should work together to resolve that using the best available information that we have. So there are emerging toolkits online which we will probably be looking to recommend they are used. They're good for baselining, they're not good for science, and I think we've been open with that in our statement response on the matter and also within the policy. This is about having regard to your carbon impact. It's about having an estimation which can help us to adopt a long-term baseline for Jersey. At the moment we have nothing, but we can create something with this policy. And we can have the industry support us in developing that evidence base. So a lot of benefit can come from this. There might be some challenges in early implementation. We want to nip those in the bud immediately. We are working on the guidance at the moment. And that's really all we can say, I think, on that.
Yes, Ms. Scott, do you want to... Are you responding on that point or not?
Well, actually, when you talked about the drafting of this policy GD5, I mean, I just, right at the end where it actually says that there's a need to demonstrate the likely environmental or sustainability benefits of the proposed development outweigh the retention of the existing building. It does raise questions, like if I knock down a whole building, build one 3 times size, stick a load of solar panels on it, is that good? And so I wonder whether, in fact, when it says outweigh the retention of the existing building, it's contemplating that that includes with kind of what modifications might be available. I mean, I think this is where we're all struggling. What's this actually trying to say, that we keep buildings and try and modify them?
Well,
in which case it should say that.
That's the starting point of the policy, as Mrs. Day said right at the beginning.
Okay, so all right, so that is what you're saying, although I didn't quite read that here. Thank you.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, I'd just like to respond about this. Obviously, one understands that this is an admirable approach. However, what will happen, because it's so, forgive me for using the term airy-fairy at the moment, it's just an added area of uncertainty for anybody putting in a planning application. And what we'd really like to know is, what is the commitment of the government to provide the science that's involved in order to accurately and efficiently implement this policy? Is there, we haven't heard anything from government. You know, there might be people establishing high-level policy, but at the end of the day, what is required is scientists working out what the carbon footprint is of particular materials and particular approaches. with particular respect to Jersey, and that is just not happening. And to
I'm just going to question that. I mean, it isn't with particular respect to Jersey, is it? I mean, concrete's concrete, whether it's in Jersey or in...
No, it's not. And with due respect, it's not.
All right, there's some different types, but by and large, it's not... Most, you can do this, you need to do this on a much wider basis than Jersey, don't you? You can't be, are you really saying to Jersey that to set up their own scientific research establishment to become a world leading
there needs to be a
carbon
factor involved,
analysis?
For sure. There needs to be a factor.
It's not realistic.
Why is it not realistic? If they're going to be asked for that information, then we need
for them to provide
something
specific to Jersey when it's not really specific to Jersey.
There could be a Jersey
factor. The whole issue is worldwide.
There could be a Jersey factor involved. The amount
okay,
at the moment we are importing sand into the island, and there is a definite carbon impact in the import of sand into the island.
Well, we're going to deal with that Wednesday morning.
But I use
it
as an example.
It's one of the questions I've got. It's one of the issues I'm going to discuss.
I use it as an example.
But I think what you've just said was you've backtracked from it a bit already by saying that you were expecting Jersey to develop their own scientific unit to analyse the carbon footprint of all materials in Jersey for Jersey, rather than using anything else that's available worldwide.
It depends on the degree of accuracy that is required by the department. That's the thing.
Well, I think they've said that they're not expecting too much. I mean, we're going to go round and round in circles here, it seems to me. I mean, the minister's admitted the science isn't there at the moment. I mean, in detail, it's emerging. That's what everyone seems to be saying.
That's our point. If the science is not there, how can you use it as the basis for a policy?
Well, you can use what there is there. It's emerging. There's something there. Is that what you're saying? What's your answer to that question?
Yeah, so I think the most important thing is starting with a consistent methodology which helps us to establish a baseline. So whether that data is wholly accurate or partially accurate, as long as you're all working from the same data set, it just means that you can have a baselining effect, so you know if you're going upwards or downwards. That is the broad level that we're talking about here, because we will not get to the absolute root of all of our carbon emissions. One point to clarify is the Minister does report on Jersey's carbon impact, so it has a greenhouse gas inventory that are published every year. That information can be used in conjunction with international data sets, even if it's a broad baseline. So our maturity in understanding our carbon impact locally is evolving. But the key thing is we appreciate that data can be limited or fragmented, but our emphasis and focus is about achieving a cultural shift and achieving a consistent baseline. So we've got, quoted in the plan already, we've got the RICS whole life carbon assessment. So that's an adopted industry standard which requires developers to consider carbon impact throughout the life cycle of the development, gives you a consistent baseline to work from. That's our starting point. You've got then other guidance such as the LETI guidance, which we are looking at the moment, which then helps the developers to understand that in a bit more kind of easier to understand context, which we might look to maybe combine those two pieces for a local piece, but we don't want to be reinventing the wheel here because this is highly complicated material.
Well, that was my point, but
can I just
add one more thing I'd like to hear from the National Trust.
So the issue is who in the department is going to be assessing what is submitted to them? Is there going to be a department within the department which is looking at this kind of thing and analysing it to see whether it's correct or not?
Okay, there's my answer. I mean, there must, someone's got to assess it.
Yeah, so there will be a programme of training and upskilling for all staff relating to all the managing emissions policies that are coming through the plan. This isn't the only one. I mentioned before as well about the department's capability to assess financial viability. That is actually supplemented with skills within the team now. So it's not impossible for the department to consider these things.
Viability. Okay. Yes, National Trust. Mrs. Taylor, please.
Thank you, sir. The National Trust has made a few detailed comments which really relate to the clarity of the policies, but since our comments in relation to policy GD5 don't make it explicitly clear, and having listened to this discussion, I would like to just emphasise that the Trust fully supports this policy. The bar needs to be raised. There are already excellent examples in Jersey of buildings that have been retained and refurbished, put to good use very successfully, even if on the face of it originally it was not economically viable. Just because the detail of carbon and sustainable development may not be as well developed as we would like, that, in our opinion, is no excuse for not raising that bar. There are some very well-known principles of sustainable development that could be used to inform this policy.
Okay, Mr. Bull, are we still struggling with virtual attendance? We still can't hear you. Just wait. Well, that's a fairly fundamental problem from my point of view. If I'm supposed to be trying to take into account what wants to be said. What's the problem? Is it, and last time it was someone was on mute. Sorry, I still can't hear you.
Are the speakers on?
Frustratingly. Can you hear him in the control, through the control? That's what happened before, though, wasn't it? With the senator. Okay. I'm very sorry. It's just impossible. I can't do anything about this. It's beyond my control. Can we keep trying? Well, Mr. Bull has something to say, I think.
Is it worth them asking to have a written submission that you could do that?
Well, it should already be in your written submissions, but it's, I mean, that's really difficult, isn't it? Because no states can't respond. I can't read.
I don't mean by submitting a written submission separately, but Teams has it.
The only other solution is for you to attend the plenary session, attend the plenary on Thursday afternoon,
I'm sure
with a 5-minute, if he's got any 5-minute, for 5-minute comments about this that you feel that you haven't covered or can't cover yourself.
I'm not
for
sure
the.
what he's written for this one, so yeah.
Okay.
Could I just come back?
Yeah, sorry, I did allow you to. I mean, if it's at all possible, I really would like to hear, but we can't wait all afternoon for that. So, Mr. Bull, yeah, and I'm going to ask the states to respond and move on to the next one.
I understand it heard in the live stream, but not in the meeting, so we might be able to.
Sorry, you.
The people online can be heard in the live stream, but not in the room. So I might.
Well, that is
maybe get a
also not very helpful at all. I hope the live stream people are enjoying it, but I can't do anything about this. Okay,
Just
Mr.
very quickly
Bull.
then. It was just to come back and say that the Minister's comment was SR 44.
Oh, hang on.
Sorry.
So what you're saying, that if I put my iPad onto live stream, other people, can the states hear that? Sorry?
It might create an echo, but. And it is about 30 seconds delayed.
This is a broadcaster's nightmare, isn't it, this?
So I've got my
Ah.
and I've been working on it for
Sorry about this.
So now I'm going to show you
It's your
how
adverts.
Grammarly to edit. Okay, so here's my essay, and I'm going to click through Grammarly suggestions in the...
Okay. Now I've got to get the right section, haven't I? There's your 30-second delay. No, well, no, this is live, I think. That's not any good. I'm sorry, I just can't do this. Oh, there you go. I mean, I'm sorry, ladies and gentlemen. This is just not. This is just not going to work. I've paused it on my thing. Mr. McCarthy, I don't normally allow people to put placards up in examination rooms, so please take it down. I've only just seen it. It's showing on the live stream, but not here. Oh, stop it. Mr. Bull, I'm very sorry. I missed what you were about to say there. Would you like to just go back and repeat it, and then we'll ask the States to wrap up? And I'm very sorry about this.
It was just really to clarify that the Minister's statement was SR 44, wasn't it, that you mentioned? Just that I still struggle with the difference in the wording of that response to that statement comparatively to the text in the policy. I just wonder whether that slight leniency that's a bit more evident in SR 44 might be more appropriate for the next 3 years as a soft start to this policy coming in and the next the next island plan, sorry, because we all want to get there. It's just getting there in a sustainable way that the island and the industry can kind of adopt and get used to and build on. I think that's probably what I would be hoping for. But
yes, okay. Does that work for you?
We'd be happy to take a look at the wording to make sure that people aren't inadvertently hit by this policy on the basis of information that doesn't yet exist. I think that's certainly not the intent, to ask for things that don't exist.
or skills. Sorry.
Or, skills. I would struggle to fully accept the skills point, because the whole point is this is meant to be pushing people to skill up in this area. It does take a while, and we do appreciate that. I think the statement response 44 draws off a lot of the wording in this. It just emphasises it. So I'll just point you to say bullet point 2 on page 86, where the overall carbon impact is a requirement to consider whether the demolition and replacement of the building would lead to less or more, and it's an estimation of emissions. So already there, it's actually it's very broad. It's not definitive. And you would have regard to that, obviously, when applying the policy. It's also very clear that it says on the third paragraph, proposals for the demolition and replacement of buildings must demonstrate, based on a holistic consideration of all these factors, how it would represent the most beneficial option relative to the submission of evidence. So again, just to reiterate that this is about the evidence that might be available and a holistic consideration. It's not intended to be an absolute stick to be beaten with. Thank you.
Yeah, so are you suggesting that I ask the states to have a look at their wording to the preamble to the policy? I mean, I know you don't like the policy.
I do like the policy.
You do? But you're just worried about...
I'm worried about the interpretation of it at the planner level, planning officer level, in terms of consistency of its application and perhaps the rigour, particularly proportionate to whatever the development is that's being put in front of them. It's a really difficult balance, and the most well-intended policies sometimes can be perhaps misinterpreted with the best will in the world. So it's just that consistency, and with a new policy particularly, the consistency sometimes is a bit awry as we get used to it. But when we arrive at that place where we understand exactly what is required, it can be a wonderful tool. It's just that learning process to get there.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's really disputing it's the objective is what we should be trying to do.
Sorry,
Okay.
can I just say something again? It's just that on page 86, it says, as a minimum, a sustainability statement should address the following environmental factors going on. So the density, and then it says the overall carbon impact. Consider whether demolition and replacement of the building would lead to less or more carbon emissions in its retention. The estimation of emissions should have regard to its contribution to emissions generated, blah, 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 blah. That's a very extreme amount of information that's required. It's not a broad brush statement that is unsupported by any data. It's actually requiring very detailed information.
Well, is it?
I could probably only point you to the FCBS estimation tool, which gives you a really good feel for the amount of information that's required, and also the RICS guidance, the carbon impact guidance. Yes, there is more information than what you presently need to provide, but there are tools that exist out there that allow you to provide it in quite a simple and easy to follow way when you know what you're looking at. So you need to know your kilowatt hours per, material used and heat requirements, etc. So yes, it does require an element of skill, but it's not to say that we shouldn't be, baking that into the development process. Unfortunately, we are in a place now that we need to think more carefully about how we build, and we need to make sure that we are taking Jersey in the right direction, and that will require a bit of extra work, and that is not just for the development industry, it's the island as a whole. Thanks.
I don't think we can really take this any further. I've heard what you've all said, and I'll take it away and have to consider what to deal with this, how to deal with it. Okay, thanks. Can we move on to GD7, the high buildings policy? This is where there was the member, Mrs. Ferguson, is it, who wanted to speak?
One last option I could suggest is that I played out loud on my laptop. Yeah.
Has that got the 30-second delay?
No. This is, I'm in the team call as well. Okay. Senator Ferguson, could I please get you to speak? I hope she heard me. No, she's on mute. Could someone use their microphone and just ask Senator Ferguson?
Yes. Senator Ferguson, could you speak, please? We were trying to get you participate in the hearing.
Well, I would, but you can't hear me.
I can assure you that we can now.
Oh, good.
Loud and clear, I think.
Oh, I'm glad.
I think would be the. I think. All right. Okay. I'm just going to ask you to. We're just moving on to policy GD7, which you've raised an issue about. Just a quick introduction on this. The policy states in the 2011 plan that there should be no more than 5 stories, but that's proposing to be relaxed. Was it relaxed in the 2014 plan, Mr. Pilley?
No.
Right, no, just a minute. And the current BIP that we're looking at talks about 8 dwellings, 8 stories as a maximum height generally, but with other caveats. Senator Ferguson, you will have seen the state's response paper to your suggested amendment, saying that it's not expecting there to be 8 stories all over the island, and that there are lots of other safeguards within the policy to help protect character in appropriate places. How would you respond to that?
Rubbish. If you'll excuse me.
Well, I do, but anything further to add to that?
Yes, I mean, the whole point about the 5 stories, which was voted in by the states of the day, it keeps the town much more user-friendly, and it is not excessively high, but we don't end up with something like Hong Kong, which is soulless. If it's too high, we've got a series of wind tunnels which doesn't improve living in town. If the buildings are too high, it could cause problems if the lifts break down. There's a building in New York where I think it's 400 feet or something, and it's so high that any problems with lifts and the residents are effectively in prison. Very high buildings, greater than 5 stories, will cause acute problems for the increasingly older population, particularly as the move to more renewable energy could well cause blackouts and problems with electricity supply, which has already been demonstrated in places like Texas. So I'm sorry, if you want to make it a soulless wind tunnel in town, then go ahead and do it for more than 5 stories. But I don't think it's right, and I don't think it's really the way to go. Thank you, sir.
Okay. Does anyone else want to make a comment before I ask the states to respond on that? Yes, Ms. Scott.
Yes, I would just point out that one of the Minister's responses to the SBBA's original proposal about height restrictions in the Bay was that we offered no evidence or analysis to support the height restrictions we were proposing. So I guess that should go both ways.
Okay, Mr. Pilley, do you want to respond to Senator Ferguson's points? My understanding is that, well, where is the policy? We're not talking about very high buildings, are we? We're talking about up to 8 stories. Is that right?
That's right, sir. So I think essentially the policy...
Only supported in exceptional circumstances where the overall benefits to the community will demonstrate outweigh any adverse impacts. And no support outside town. So, okay, what's your comment on that?
I think so. Just a point of clarification in terms of the current policy. The current policy talks about 18 metres as being a definition of a tall building. That's under BE5 of the current island plan, and then talks about anything above that height requires exceptional justification. So just to make clearer about the current policy regime. I think the proposed policy regime for tall buildings as set out in the bridging plan seeks to reflect on both what's happened in terms of the some of the developments that we've seen over the current island plan period.
Well, yes, I mean, I've walked around. I mean, clearly that policy hasn't. Well, there might have been quite a lot of exceptional circumstances. But
well, I think it's just a reflection.
Generally, I mean, there's a general change between the waterfront areas and some of the areas facing the bay, but compared to what's in the old town and elsewhere.
Correct, that's right, sir. So I think clearly the waterfront for St Helier is a new district of St Helier. It's evolving its own character with a relationship, whilst still having a relationship with the rest of the town. And I think the plan is simply seeking to reflect the characteristics of different parts of St Helier and seeking to respond to those characteristics. So it shouldn't be viewed as a a blanket application of 8 stories across St Helier. The evidence that's submitted in relation to the policy is quite clearly part of the evidence base for the plans. So the review of the St Helier urban character appraisal, which was undertaken in 2005 and reviewed in 2021, provides the evidence base for the assessment of the character of different parts of St Helier. And the policy seeks to reflect that, sir, in the sense that you'll see baked into the provisions of the policy is a specific reference to that.
The first bullet point of the policy.
That's right, sir. So it's about saying the issues about looking at the context of development and seeking to ensure that any taller buildings that might be proposed throughout the town are assessed relative to their context, which is different in different parts of the town. And different parts of the town have a greater or lesser ability to accommodate buildings of greater height or greater density. I think if we look at the thrust of the plan, where we seek to increase the development yield from within the existing built-up area, the response to that may involve increases in density, and it may involve increases in height. And this policy is designed to provide us with a framework against which proposals that might come forward in different parts of the town can be appropriately assessed. So it's perhaps a more nuanced or sophisticated approach, where we look at the different character of different parts of the town and look at its ability to accommodate development of different heights. And as you've already stated, sir, clearly the waterfront is an area that is capable of accommodating buildings of greater height, and indeed we've seen that already take place, although the policy seeks to provide a threshold over which anything would require exceptional justification.
Okay. Senator Ferguson, can you still hear me, and does that give you any reassurance?
Frankly, sir, no. In my 20 years as a States member, I have noticed that if there is a maximum limit anywhere in the island, then a developer will build to the maximum. It may take 2 or 3 iterations of the planning application, but it doesn't work, sir, not in practice. The planners, with the best will in the world, are caught between a rock and a hard place, and unfortunately the general public appears to be the part that the whole thing sort of falls apart on. It doesn't give me any confidence, I'm afraid. So, and I think of all these old ladies who are stuck at the top of a 12-story building. They'll be in prison. You know, it's we need to look at the whole community, not just, particularly as a lot of the older office buildings are being converted to flats, so that will be used as an excuse to make the buildings taller. You know, sorry.
Well, okay,
until
well,
we have
existing buildings, aren't they? But okay,
yes, but
well, I've
the
noted
problem
them.
the real problem is, if you'll excuse me, that the planners don't seem to take the context into account. That is one of the founding precepts of the Royal Society of Town Planners, from my reading of the website, and I don't think they ever take it into account. So, no, I have no faith in this. And that's a 20-year politician.
Okay, thanks. I've noted what you say. I mean, well, context. Well, I can read the policy and I can see what it says about context and whatever. Is there anything else you wanted to say?
I'd just like to say, sir, that the current Bridging Island Plan sets out new policy with regard to placemaking. So in addition to the provisions of this policy, there are other policies set out in the plan which emphasise the need to have regard or greater regard to the issue of context, and that that's something that this new policy framework seeks to give greater emphasis to. So we would expect that our colleagues in the development control team and the development industry is required to have greater regard to this, to the issue of context and the impact of development, not just within the red lines of their application site, but in terms of the either the townscape or the landscape setting that their development proposal is sat within, sir. And we would submit that the draft plan provides the additional policy tools to enable that to have greater effect.
Thank you. Mr. Nicholson, did you still want to say anything?
Yeah, I've got some comments about the application of this policy again. So we've talked about the first bullet point. So the first bullet point of the policy effectively embeds the St Helier Urban Character Appraisal Review of 2021 as a guidance document. I've got 2 points to present to you today. First of all, in the on page 318 of the Island Plan, that isn't the document which is referenced when tall building policy. The application of the tall building policy is discussed, because the Urban Character Appraisal Review is not the adopted supplementary planning guidance for St Helier. That we have another document which is adopted by the Minister, and that is the design guidance for St Helier, which also deals with height. So I would like to be clear on which document we're referring to. The St Helier Urban Character Appraisal, as far as I'm aware, was subject to only very limited consultation during its production, and it now appears to be embedded in the primary policy framework.
Okay, what's your response to that?
A couple of points. Is
there a mismatch here between? Is that
no, sir.
That's not quite right.
The St Helier Urban Character Appraisal is a broader document within which there are some specific design guidance for St Helier. So the proposal would be, sir, that upon
within different areas of St Helier.
That's right. So
character zone. Yes, I've read it.
That's right. So the interestingly, you know, we get beaten over the head when we are told that we have a lot of work to do in terms of producing supplementary planning guidance. Here we have some supplementary planning guidance that is embedded in a piece of evidence base that is proposed to be adopted if the policy as drafted is approved as part of the new plan, sir.
So hang on, so this policy, this is a potential performance measure on page 318 of the plan, which is quoted, Mr. Nicholson rightly refers to SPG height guidance. What is that referring to, that SPG height guidance?
That is referring
to... Is that referring to the capacity study, or is it referring to something else?
No, it's referring to the design guidance which is embedded in the St Helier Urban Character Appraisal. So if you look at that document, sir, there is some design guidance which forms part of that document.
So they are one and the same thing?
Well, yeah, clearly the study of itself it comprises a number of parts. One part of which is is the design guidance. So it is that part that we would seek to adopt to inform this particular element of policy, sir. So
okay. Does that answer your question?
I think it does. That was news to me, but I think that is clarification.
What was your point too?
Well, my point was that the design guidance would, if it is to be adopted, is it going to be subject to separate consultation, etc., or is it coming as part of the Bridging Island Plan embedded within it?
Well, the evidence base has been available since all year, so I'm not quite sure exactly what date we published the Urban Character Appraisal, but it was either available from April or if not before.
Actually, I seem to recall, but I might be wrong.
Look, so is all the evidence base becoming adopted SPG through the adoption of the Bridging Island Plan?
I think, as I just said, sir, the relevant part of the St Helier Urban Character Appraisal would be adopted as design guidance.
There's something you can do. No, just a minute, Ms. Scott. Mr. Nicholson, what was your second point?
My second point was, if that is the case, which has pros and cons, I'd like some of the kind of nuances of the SPG to also be reflected in the policies themselves. I've got a table on page 92 of the island plan, which, for example, says in character area 5, the old harbours, up to 3 stories height guidance. That isn't what the SPG says. The SPG identifies several opportunity sites where the design guide is deferred for further articulation. There are 3 or 4 sites within the Old Harbours area which aren't covered by the same guidance within this document. And I think that if we are looking at that table on page 92, we should be clear that there will be other opportunities, perhaps emerging through proposed design guides, as the soon-to-be adopted SPG suggests, where different height arrangements may be suitable.
Well,
the follow-up.
Sure. What's your response? It's guidance.
Exactly, sir. It's guidance, and as set out in the policy framework, anything that seeks to challenge that guidance can be subject to a justification, where any particular design that seeks to go beyond that guidance would need to be justified relative to its context and its purpose, sir.
I'd like to work with the guidance and have that written into the island plan that there will be other opportunities as the SPG identifies, which will be articulated in design guidance in due course. I think we can be a lot more positive than put things down to potential future discussions. A lot more positive.
Okay.
My final point is at the top of page 91 of the Bridging Island Plan, that says in the first full paragraph, it says the urban character appraisal has identified that high-rise buildings over 8 stories will always be conspicuous landmarks, etc., etc. They will therefore not be supported in St Helier. That isn't what the policy then says. The policy is quite clear that there may be circumstances where they are appropriate. And I think we need to look very carefully at this section on tall buildings. We know that we will be asked to deliver height as part of the spatial strategy, and I'm very concerned that we need to be all on the same page as we take these points forward, sir.
Well,
yeah, I was just going to say, sir, clearly the policy states that development of a tall building over 8 stories will only be supported in exceptional circumstances.
Yeah, maybe clarify the supporting text there, couldn't
Yeah.
we? Okay. Yes, sorry.
Sir, following on...
No, hang on, Mr. Scott. Yeah.
Can I just say that there's, in this policy and in the preambles to the policy, there are an awful lot of different definitions of what a tall building is. So on page 89, a tall building is simply tall buildings are simply those that are taller than their surroundings, which is a relatively limited interpretation. Obviously, there are various other interpretations of it in terms of there being 4 to 5, or as in the table on page 92. Then in the policy itself, a tall building is one where it is 2 or more stories above the prevailing contextual height, which does actually allow a huge amount of leeway in terms of when a building is termed to be a tall building or not. It was interesting listening to the department before. There's a sort of a supposition that this is to do with St Helier, but I don't see it just being relating to St Helier. It's relating to all other areas, presumably within the built-up area or indeed in the island as a whole.
Which bullet point are you referring me to there?
No, I'm not. It's just that
in the policy.
Well, it's just the points made by Mr. Pilley before was referring to tall buildings. I don't know whether by design or not, but it's just inferring that it was about St Helier, but it's not. In terms of the way that the policy is worded, it's everywhere. So in the first and most extreme instance, as on page 89, it's any building that's taller than its surroundings. Latterly, it's a building which is 2 or more stories above the prevailing contextual height. And then it goes on to say that those tall buildings, this is in the policy, needs to have ground floor activities that provide a positive relationship to the surrounding streets and public realm. I'm not sure what that means. I have an idea of what it means, but it doesn't seem to me particularly enlightening. And then just the other thing is at the top of page 893, just above the policy, it says, in all cases, plant and equipment or other structures essential to the use of a building should be located within the existing building envelope and not on top of the roofs. I'm not sure how that's going to work in practice.
Okay, you might have to take a story off.
Well, the implication is...
Sorry, that's a bit facetious, but, you know, that might be a way it could work.
Sorry, the implication is, if I might explain...
well, I think I understand your point.
In really tall buildings, it is possible to have a floor given over to plant. But in the sort of height of buildings that we have generally in Jersey, the most efficient place to put the plant is on the roof. And that's demonstrated by nearly all of the buildings that have been built in town in the last 20 years.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I mean, I understand the point. Mr. Pilley, what do you...
Yeah, I mean...
do you have a comment? Any comments on that?
Well, just in terms of the definition of a tall building, clearly the policy is states what we consider a tall building to be, and that definition simply then triggers the requirement of this policy test, sir, which would then be applied to tall buildings wherever they are proposed anywhere across the island. Clearly, the issue around ground floor activities and their relationship to the surrounding streets and the public realm, that may benefit from some qualification, but I think in the we see taller buildings that have the potential to offer a very limited level of activity or relationship to the public realm, and this point is simply seeking to ensure that where we do get taller buildings, that they don't sterilise the public realm that surrounds them. In terms of the issue of plant and materials, we are simply seeking to ensure that that's treated as an integral element of design, rather than something that appears as something that's just stuck on top of the building, and it should be appropriately addressed at the design stage. So.
Okay. Scott, what did you want to say?
Sir, this policy clearly doesn't just apply to St Helier, and the point has been raised that there has been guidance extracted from the St Helier urban character appraisal. May I remind you that there is a St Brellard's Bay character appraisal which also has got height guidance in it, in the recommendation 3.6, which appears to have been ignored by the Minister. And in fact, in a conversation about tourist enterprises, 3.5 mentioned removing this exemption in Policy 1 as well, which we've discussed. So I would actually say, well, maybe the department looks like it's been cherry-picking, sir, because it seems to have ignored these recommendations, which have been prepared by its own consultants, whilst importing them from the St Helier character appraisal.
You've ignored St Brellard's Bay.
As if we could ignore St Brellard's Bay, sir.
Well, I won't let you.
I think one of the proposals for St Brellard's Bay is the development of an improvement plan for the bay, and I think as an integral part of that work we would look to develop some specific design guidance for St Brellard's Bay.
So may I say in response to that, though, the improvement plan isn't a spatial plan, and we have had spatial advice in this character appraisal, and of course height is one of those elements.
Well, are you saying you want... Well, what part of this policy do you want changing then? Because the definition that would apply to St Brellard's Bay would be the first paragraph, wouldn't it?
Indeed, sir.
Two or more stories above the prevailing contextual height. So if you've got a two-storey building in St Brelade's Bay, a tall building's 4 storeys? You
So-
think that's too high?
I simply say that the character appraisal has identified areas in which the height should be restricted to that of the current houses. So it shouldn't just be this policy that gets amended, it should be the spatial strategy as well.
It's a tall buildings policy, but aren't what other policies are there in the
Then
plan relating to buildings, relating to their scale and nature of the surrounding development? There's other policies, aren't there?
There
General policies
are.
about
So
that.
there's a general design quality policy which would pick up those issues of relationship to context and adjacent buildings. But I think, as you identify, sir, clearly if there were any proposals for tall buildings that took place anywhere across the island that fell within the definition in the first paragraph, then of GD7, then GD7 would effectively be triggered, and the proposal would need to address the considerations set out in the policy.
Is it the intention to include some of the character appraisal for St Brelade's Bay in the improvement plan with regard to design guidance, or not?
We would very much like to develop some design guidance for St Brelade's Bay, sir.
But I would repeat that this minister has specifically said that's not a spatial strategy. So that would not be sufficient to incorporate the recommendations of the consultants in policy in paragraph 3.6 of the character appraisal.
Okay, is there anything to add to that? Or? Has anyone else got anything to say on tall buildings? No. You can't just come in.
The Architecture Association, the Jersey Architects Commission isn't here. They're meant to be speaking.
Well, no, I'm sorry.
I'm Sustainable Commissioner of the Jersey Architecture Commission, so I may speak on their behalf.
No, because well,
You invited them, so...
do you have any authority to speak on their behalf?
Well, I was the Sustainable Commissioner of the Jersey Architecture Commission.
You'll include it in your plenary session point.
There isn't time. It's such an important subject, because what is significant is that what would normally happen, pre-design the plan, they assessed the differences. So they said, here's the existing island plan on tall buildings, here's the changes, and sustainable appraisal then would tell the public what is the harm that it's going to cause, which being stated. Is there a way of overcoming that harm? If not, it should be objected. That assessment has not been carried out. The other thing is, you're using the skyline, the character appraisal, where local authorities in the UK have a tall building study. There is no tall building study. So, furthermore, the 4 stories in the character appraisal, it says the island can accommodate all its housing needs within 4 stories. You could build 4 times as many buildings that already exist in the island within 4 stories, within the existing footprint. The only reason that these tall buildings have been proposed are by developers that individually want to maximise their return for their sites.
Okay, look, okay, I'm going to stop you there. This wasn't in your own submission, was it?
Yes, it was. I did cover the fact is there is no...
Okay, I'll take it into account then if it was. I've checked it. It wasn't one of the bullet points I had in your submission, which I have read, so I'll check it back and take it into account.
Because I was 2 days late in asking to speak because of a bereavement, that has not been accepted, and I think that's extremely unfair.
Sir, if it helps, I came here as an observer today, but I am a current Jersey Architecture Commissioner.
Okay. But you're not down as an... Oh, I see. You're at the table, though. Did you not have...
The table, I'm just observing.
Well, that's the same thing applies, doesn't it? I mean, we've tried to take a very strict line on this. I'm sorry about this, Mr. McCarthy. You're coming to the plenary. I have read, your submissions, and I've made a note of that. again to read your submission about this. So I can't really take that any further. It's just not fair on everybody to start allowing people to turn up and speak, as I've already said to you once before, even though I did allow you to speak once before. So, Mr. Pilley,
I was just going to make the point, sir, in light of the earlier session that we had. I think it was one of the housing sessions when the you ruled on the involvement of the Jersey Architecture Commission, effectively, sir, and they were initially down to speak today, but they've withdrawn from attending today on the basis of the prior discussion in the housing session, sir.
Well, maybe that was Mr. Holland, I think. I can't remember which of us did that. Okay, well, I mean, I've got all these submissions. I'll look at the policy again and reread any relevant written submissions about it. I was just going to then now go on to, well, finally, I think it's a very discrete point about the policy GD10, is it? The 1% for art, which is 0.25% more than it was before. I'm not sure that anyone here has objected to that, have they? I picked up on that earlier. Okay, I mean, I've got that. I mean, there was a question Mr. Holland and I have been talking about. There's the sort of general issue of viability here. I mean, this is just a question for you. I'm not going to allow people to come back on this. You have updated your viability study, haven't you, in April 21, which does give some fairly clear, I mean, with regard to this, the general thrust of that, let's put it this way, is that viability has certainly not worsened since the earlier, fuller work in 2017. And that is not disputed by the states, is it? Right, okay. Let's just leave that there and leave everyone that we've noted that. Okay, that's it, thanks. Thank you very much for your participation. If you're coming to the plenary, you'll see me, and if you're coming to the minerals and waste session, you'll see me on Wednesday morning. Otherwise, Mr. Holland will be here to talk about infrastructure and travel and transport tomorrow morning. Thanks very much, everybody.